He started telling me about his previous hospital stays, though none of them were in his file. He described procedures in graphic detail, mentioned nurses by name, talked about hospitals and cities I'd never heard of. His words were slurred slightly, and I wondered if he might be experiencing side effects from pain medication, though his chart showed he'd refused all medication since admission. I glanced at the call button to make sure it was within his reach, a habit I'd developed over years of working with unpredictable patients. For some reason, that simple gesture made him smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made me realize I was alone in a room with someone who might be dangerous, and my only backup was at the nurse's station 3 doors down. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me it was interesting how much trust we place in patients, how vulnerable nurses are when they're alone in rooms with strangers. He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather, but the implication was crystal clear. I felt my heart rate spike. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that I'd dealt with difficult patients before, that there were protocols for situations like this. I told him I needed to check on another patient, and I'd be back soon. As I turned to leave, he called out that I should be more careful about which rooms I enter alone at night. I walked out of that room as calmly as I could manage, but the moment the door closed behind me, I practically ran to the nurse's station. My hands were shaking as I pulled up his file again, searching for anything that might explain his behavior. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. A small note in the system from the ER doctor. Patient extremely agitated during examination. Security was required. Recommend psychological evaluation. Why hadn't anyone told me this? Why was he placed on my floor without a security watch? I immediately notified my supervisor, who seemed annoyed that I was bothering her but agreed to look into it. She told me to continue my rounds and she'd handle it. That response didn't sit well with me, but I had other patients who needed care. I avoided room 314 for the next hour, getting other nurses to check on him when necessary. Every time I walked past that door, I could feel my pulse quicken. Around 4:30 a.m., my supervisor called me into her office. She had this tight expression on her face that I couldn't quite read. She told me that Robert Chen had checked himself out against medical advice. Just got up, got dressed in the clothes he'd arrived in, and walked out of the hospital. No one had stopped him because technically he wasn't being held involuntarily. But here's the thing that terrified me. The security footage showed him leaving through the emergency exit on our floor, which meant he would have walked right past the nurse's station. None of us saw him leave. My supervisor seemed more concerned about the liability of him leaving without proper discharge than about how he'd managed to slip past all of us. She asked me to document the interaction in detail, which I did, though I left out some of the more unsettling parts. I didn't want to seem paranoid or dramatic. The shift ended at 7 a.m., but I stayed late to talk to the day shift nurse taking over my patients. I warned her about the situation, even though the room was now empty. She gave me this sympathetic look like I'd just had a rough night and needed to go home and sleep. Maybe she was right. But here's what kept me up for days afterward. 3 weeks later, I was scrolling through local news on my phone and saw a story about a man who'd been arrested for breaking into a nurse's home about 20 miles from the hospital. The article included a photo. It was Robert Chen. According to the report, he had a history of stalking healthcare workers and had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years. The victim was a night shift nurse from a different hospital who'd treated him months earlier. She came home after her shift to find him sitting in her living room. He told the police he just wanted to talk to her, that he'd felt a connection during his hospital stay. Thankfully, she wasn't hurt. Her neighbor had called 911 after seeing someone break in through a window. When I saw that article, everything from that night came flooding back. The way he'd watched me, the things he'd said about nurses being vulnerable, how he'd asked if I'd ever made a mistake I couldn't take back. I realized he'd been testing me, maybe even planning something. I reported it to my supervisor immediately, and she finally took it seriously. Hospital security pulled our footage and confirmed it was the same person. They filed a report with the police, who told me they'd add my statement to their case file. They also informed me that he'd been released on bail and they weren't sure of his current whereabouts. For weeks after that, I was paranoid. I checked my back seat before getting in my car, looked over my shoulder constantly, and installed a security system in my apartment. I started working day shifts instead, even though the pay was less and the environment more stressful. I couldn't handle the isolation of night shift anymore. Couldn't handle walking down empty hallways, wondering if every patient might be someone dangerous. The worst part was the doubt that crept in. Had I overreacted? Should I have documented his behavior more thoroughly that night? Could I have prevented what happened to that other nurse if I'd pushed harder for a security watch? My therapist tells me I can't blame myself for someone else's actions, but the guilt lingers. It's been almost 6 months now, and I've gotten better about managing the anxiety. I still work day shifts, and I probably always will. I've also become that nurse who's overly cautious, who always checks the patient's background thoroughly, who never enters a room alone if something feels off. Some of my coworkers probably think I'm paranoid, but I don't care. The hospital implemented new protocols after the incident, better communication about potentially dangerous patients, mandatory security presence for certain cases, panic buttons in every room. It shouldn't have taken something like this to make those changes, but at least they happened. I still love being a nurse, despite everything. But I've learned that trusting your instincts isn't paranoia, it's survival. That feeling I had when I first saw his admission paperwork, that sense that something was wrong, I should have listened to it immediately. I should have refused to enter that room alone. I don't know where Robert Chen is now. The last I heard, he'd been moved to a long-term psychiatric facility after violating his bail conditions. But I try not to follow the case too closely. It's better for my mental health to create some distance. What I do know is that I'll never forget the way he stared at me that night, or the casual cruelty in his voice when he talked about how vulnerable I was. Every time I clock in for a shift now, I remember that night. Not because I want to, but because I need to. It's a reminder to stay alert, to trust my gut, and to never assume that just because someone is in a hospital gown, they're not a threat. The trade-off for helping people is sometimes encountering those who don't want help. They want something much darker. I've been working as a night shift nurse at Mercy General for about 4 years now. Most people think healthcare is all about saving lives and dramatic ER moments, but the reality is much quieter, especially on the overnight shift. I actually prefer it that way. Fewer administrators, less chaos, just me and my patients. But there's always a trade-off. Every once in a while, something happens that makes you question whether you should have just worked days. I never kept detailed notes about weird incidents before, but after what happened last spring, I started documenting everything. Not officially, just in a personal journal. The hospital would probably frown upon it if they knew, but I need some way to process what I experienced that night. I still think about it constantly. It was a Tuesday, sometime around 3 a.m. when I got assigned to a new patient in room 314. The night had been relatively quiet up until that point, which I'd learned to appreciate over the years. You know that feeling when everything seems too calm and you just know something's about to go wrong? That's exactly what I felt when I saw the admission paperwork. The patient was a middle-aged man named Robert Chen, admitted for observation after a minor car accident. No serious injuries, just some bruising and a possible concussion. The thing that struck me as odd was that there was almost no information in his file. No emergency contact, no primary care physician, barely any medical history. It was like he'd appeared out of nowhere. I probably should have questioned it more, maybe talked to the attending physician, but we were short-staffed that night, and I had 6 other patients to monitor. I grabbed the medication tray and headed down the hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered as I walked. They'd been doing that for weeks, and maintenance kept saying they'd fix it. When I opened the door to 314, I immediately noticed something was off. Most patients admitted for observation are either sleeping or watching TV at that hour, maybe scrolling through their phones. This man was sitting completely upright in bed, staring directly at the door like he'd been waiting for me. Not just glancing over, staring, with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I introduced myself, trying to keep my voice professional and friendly, and checked his wristband to confirm his identity. He didn't respond, just kept watching me with these dark, unblinking eyes. I've dealt with a lot of confused patients before, people coming out of anesthesia or dealing with dementia, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. I started my routine checks, blood pressure, temperature, oxygen levels, and the whole time he never looked away from my face. I tried to make small talk, asking him how he was feeling, if he needed anything for pain, but he remained silent. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Then he finally spoke. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it in days. He asked me if I'd ever made a mistake that I couldn't take back. The question caught me completely off guard. I let out this nervous laugh and said something generic about everyone making mistakes. trying to redirect the conversation back to his care. But he didn't react to my deflection. He just kept staring,